When knitting socks, it's important to understand sock construction as well as what type of yarn to use. When knitting socks from the top down, there are 4 main parts of the sock. The cuff, which usually starts with some sort of stretchy ribbing. The heel, which is then turned. The gusset, which matches the decreases to hug your foot. And then the toe. In order to make a durable, long-lasting sock, you probably want to use some type of yarn with wool content. Because wool is a natural fiber, it breathes very well and will last a lot longer than something like cotton. Now let's begin by doing the cuff of a sock. To begin knitting your sock from the top down, begin by casting on the amount of stitches you need to use for your cuff. In this case, I'm using 40 stitches because I'm using a worsted weight yarn. After you've casted on your stitches, you need to divide the stitches evenly, or as evenly as possible, on double pointed needles. To do this, simply slip each stitch very carefully onto another double pointed needle. You want to make sure that you're not twisting any of these stitches because that can cause you problems later on. It's important to note that you want to use a relatively stretchy cast on. So if you find that using a backwards loop cast on is a little too tight for your sock, you can use a knitted cast on or a long tail cast on. When you go to use the next stitch or the next needle, just continue in the same way. Now that I've evenly distributed all of my stitches, I'm going to make sure that I don't twist any of the stitches so that I can join them in the round for knitting. So as you can see, I've lined up all of my stitches pointing towards the center to make sure they're all pointing in the right direction. And it's important to look at each one of these places where your needles are joining to make sure you didn't twist them in any way. Now take your last needle, slide it down to the end so that we can begin knitting. So for knitting in the round with double pointed needles, it's really the same as knitting any other way. You're going to make sure your tail yarn is out of the way. You're going to knit this first stitch really tightly to close that gap. Oops. It may look a little awkward at first, but it's actually really easy. And I'm doing a knit 1, purl 1 rib to have a nice stretchy top. You might have a knit 1, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, whatever your pattern calls for. And you're just going to knit as usual until you reach the end of the needle. And now that I've reached the end of the needle, I'm just going to slide my stitches down and turn my work and get the next needle. Just a little. Slide those stitches down and continue working the same way here. And if you don't pull your stitches tight enough between needles, you might get this effect called laddering, which is a slight gap between your stitches. In order to combat that, you want to make sure to pull the first and second stitches on each needle nice and tight. And that's really all there is to knitting with double pointed needles. Now you'll continue doing your rib for a couple of inches, maybe 1 inch, 2 inches, whatever you really want. What the pattern says or the desired effect. Once you've done that, You just want to continue on with the cuff, either in plain stockinette or whatever pattern your design calls for. And this is what it'll look like. As you can see, the ribbing is slightly tighter than the rest of the cuff, so that'll keep your sock up but still is stretchy to fit around your heel and be very comfortable.